I have 11-foot ceilings in my shop, and because most of that higher wall space never get used for anything, it's kind of wasted. I've used 5/8" all-thread rods to make floating shelves for customers over the years and did a series of videos a few years ago exploring various ways to make floating shelves. Using all-thread rods is the simplest method I have found, and it gives you very strong shelves. I'll go through the process of installing these in this video, but let me first mention that these shelves are 18 inches wide, which might surprise you because that's a wider shelf under normal circumstances, and typically the wider you go with shelves, the more likely they are to sag. Wider shelves can hold more things, which increases the weight on the shelves overall. So going with shelves this wide is a bit of an experiment for me, but I already know that installing the shelves correctly will give me a great deal of strength and usefulness based on my prior experiences with floating shelves installed with all-thread rods. I started with a level line using a laser on the wall at the height where I want to place my lowest shelf. My plan is to hit every other stud in this 8-foot length with a 5/8" all-thread rod that's 18 inches long. I will thread the rods into the studs 2 inches deep. Here's the way my wall is constructed to give you an idea as to the parameters I'm working with. The reason for the 4-foot tall stem wall is that it is a retaining wall against the elevated slope of the ground on the back side of the shop. All the studs and all the walls in my shop are 2x6 pine. I intend to end up with 3 8-foot shelves that are 18 inches wide with 18 inches between each shelf. I'm interested in having the 18 inches of depth in order to have more storage capacity over a typical shelf, which is in the 12 to maybe 14-inch range. These 2 black canvas bags are slightly hanging off these shelves and are probably in the range of 40 to 50 pounds each. They contain 3 fly fishing float tubes and all the waders and fins and other equipment that goes along with them. It's really nice to not have them taking up a lot of floor space somewhere, and also being stored in these canvas bags for protection. The most important part for me in using an all-thread rod as shelf support is to make sure to thread the rod into the 2x6 dead center. So I will pinpoint that location by using a small drill bit to locate the edge of the stud at each spot where an all-thread rod will be installed. To actually install the rod, I start with a drill bit that is about 1/16 of an inch smaller than the diameter of the all-thread rod, which in my case is 5/8 of an inch. This is something that can be experimented with depending on your circumstances, but I prefer to ream the hole out a little bit with the drill bit to prep it for the next step. I now take a short piece of 5/8" all-thread rod and sand the tip of it down some, so that it slips into my pre-drilled hole fairly easily. Then I cut threads into the hole in the stud to prep it for final installation of my 18-inch piece of rod. After backing my cutter piece out of the hole, I can now spin my 18-inch piece of rod into place. I use masking tape to mark the 2-inch depth that I need for my final installation. I know some of you are already asking about the handle I'm using to do the cutting and installing the rod in place. It is a 1-inch piece of steel tubing that has a 5/8" nut welded to the center of it. That's all there is to it, so if you do very much of this type of installation, it comes in quite handy. There are other ways of accomplishing the same purpose with wrenches and tightening 2 nuts against each other on the rod. Using a crescent wrench on the nut furthest away from the wall, with this jam nut technique, you can spin the rod in place. That is the method I use when I'm installing a rod too close to a corner for my handle to spin freely on the end of the rod. Obviously, there are other ways to accomplish this same purpose if you get a little creative and think about it. But if you have access to a welder, this tool is an easy solution. I'm needing to install 9 rods in total with 3 supporting each piece of particle board. Since I'm butting the particle board up against the adjacent wall in the corner, I will support the underside of it with a piece of wood screwed in place underneath. The whole premise to this all-thread rod installation is that it's strong because you're using steel supports for the shelf. Even though the 5/8" rods extend out at a 90-degree angle from the face of the wood studs, there's really not a lot of flex over the 18 inches of the rod. I'm sure there's some amount of weight that if it's placed directly on the end of the rod, it could bend the rod or else tear out the stud where the rod is threaded. But the closer you move the load to the wall, the more the weight is pressing directly down, and the amount of weight required to cause some kind of failure of the rod increases exponentially because the steel is going to have to shear or snap to cause a failure. The other factor that's important in the strength of the overall installation is that placing an 18-inch wide shelf that is 8 feet long on the 3 rods and the corner support piece, whatever weight is placed on that shelf gets distributed over that structure, so each rod is carrying a portion of the overall weight that's on the shelf. So while I can reach up and wiggle the shelf a little and get some sort of bounce, the installation is going to be nowhere close to failing with the amount of weight that I can envision normally placing on a shelf like this. The other benefit to this type of installation over what I would typically do, which would be some sort of support bracket placed under the shelf, is that there are no brackets interfering with anything that I wish to place on the shelf, which is a nice benefit. The shelves are open to put anything lengthwise or heighthwise that will fit without any interference of the brackets. I had a 4x8 sheet of 5/8 inch particle board that I'm not sure why I ever actually bought, because I don't really use anything less than 3/4 inch sheet goods for shelving, but I had it and I'm happy to get rid of it. My only reservation is that it is potentially going to have a tendency to sag a little between the all-thread rods depending upon the amount of weight centered on the shelves between the all-threads. And so I'll screw some blocks to the wall in between the rods to add support to those areas to help eliminate that potential problem. In thinking through how I want to secure the shelves to the rods, I knew I wanted to put a couple of these clamps on each rod, and in all likelihood that was all that was really needed. But something in the back of my brain was bothering me that there was nothing laterally holding the shelf in place. Maybe if we had an earthquake, which we don't typically have where I live, but assuming we did, I guess it's possible that the vibration could allow the shelves to slide off the rods, even with the clamps in place. So I had this bright idea of placing a nut on the end of each rod and routing out a small area on the underside of the shelf where that nut would be, that would allow the nut to catch the shelf and keep it from sliding off if something really weird happened. Oh well, I've been known to overthink things quite a bit, and this would definitely qualify as that. But that's why there's a nut on the end of the rods. Again, because of the 5/8 inch particle board, I decided to place 1.5 inch wide edging on the front edge of the shelf to give the edge additional strength along its length. This is a very common method used in construction to strengthen materials, and is the idea behind any type of I-beam that's used in building structures, and it works. Because I didn't always drill my holes exactly perpendicular to the studs, over a distance of 18 inches sticking out from the wall, it was fairly obvious where I had some angles wrong in my drilling process. So I took a piece of pipe to use as a cheater bar and tried to straighten the alignment. In all likelihood, I was crushing the wood inside the hole I drilled to adjust the alignment rather than bending the rod, but it helped a little to allow the shelves to sit flatter on the all threads. The cautions I would mention in doing these types of installations are probably 3. One way you can mess up is to not directly drill into the center of the stud. I don't know structurally how much a misaligned hole would change the strength factor, but depending on how bad you miss the center, I would think it could be fairly significant. So again, it's important to make sure that you place the 5/8 inch rod in the center of the 1 3/8 wide stud. Second, while I would personally still feel okay about doing a modified installation like this in a 2x4 wall, I would be cautious about the amount of weight that I intended to put on those shelves. The reason being that I would probably only go about 1 inch to 1.5 inches max for the depth of my hole. For 2x6 walls, I'm not worried about it, but 2x4 studs give me some additional things to think about. And the last concern is being aware that electrical lines are running alongside your studs and passing through your studs, as is plumbing and sewer lines in some areas. Electrical wiring in particular should be running in the center of the studs, but that doesn't mean that's always the case. So if you hit an electrical wire, which I have done one time while drilling into a stone-covered 2x6 wall, you have a repair job to do. I guess the only question that remains is, will I extend these 3 shelves out to meet the exterior wall? We'll see.